Okie dokie. Kate, thanks ever so much again for doing this. We worked with you before last year, I think, and it was just a great session. So I'm ever so glad you're coming back to speak with us and spend some time on the next hour or so, which is this Experts at Work session is on career development, practical tools and strategies to support career development and overcome imposter syndrome. The sessions for members of all three of our networks, as I'm sure you know. And as you just heard, we're recording this one. Kate's a program director and career coach at Career Counselling Services. Kate Mansfield, give your full name just in case you want to link in with Kate. You're going to share some practical tools to help individuals construct work on their own terms. What a lovely phrase that is, including a tool for managing imposter syndrome, which we'll practice in breakout rooms. And there's a poll, really nice question coming up later, which will be interesting. So timings, so there's a breakout room, as I say, for this one, a little bit later after hearing from Kate, and then we've got a hard finish at 1 o'clock. Do send us questions and suggestions via the chat throughout. Always good to see them. And we'll send Kate's slides around to everyone tomorrow latest. But for now, if you put yourself on mute, if you haven't already, thank you ever so much. Kate, the floor is yours, and thank you again for doing this and for all your help.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody. It's got some slides to bring up and share with you, but I would love to make this as interactive a session as we possibly can. So as Richard has already alluded to, please feel free to use the chat. We've got a poll, we've got some breakout discussions, but Richard will keep an eye on the chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we go through the session together. Just in terms of briefly, my interest in this, as Richard mentioned, I am first and foremost a career coach for Career Counselling Services, as well as the director of sort of programs working with organisations. And I see and coach a lot of people, both men and women, who do admit to suffering from imposter syndrome. So it's something that I'm pretty passionate about in terms of work and how it might be potentially impacting and holding people back in the workplace. So I'd love to do some input on that and also hear from you as we go through the session. So in terms of what I hope to cover, to share initially some of the themes, context and barriers from a kind of wider career development lens, particularly in the light of COVID and the changes in the way that we work in the last few years. I think it's useful to just take a step back and perhaps consider those things before we dive into the topic. So then really want to share with you some of the research, particularly I think one or two studies which have been more in depth and looking over a long period of time at imposter syndrome, maybe to just bust a few myths or preconceptions that we might have about it, and particularly to think about how it does manifest in the workplace. So you might be attending today with perhaps some of your own imposter syndrome in mind, because many of us maybe suffer from it to varying degrees and at varying different stages within our career. But you also may be thinking about your colleagues around you. So really want to bring to life, how it might be manifesting, and perhaps sometimes we're not aware of the way that it may be impacting others around us. And then at CCS, we like to get very, very practical. So I want to give you some time in breakout rooms to discuss how you notice it manifests in your own workplace. That doesn't have to be for yourself, but certainly in your workplace context, and then to look at some practical tools and structures for actually how can we help colleagues to overcome this as far as we can anyway, at least to develop better coping mechanisms in their careers to reduce its impact. I hope that's okay. Let's just kick off with reminding you a little bit about the context of COVID in the last few years, and then think about how that links to career development and what people might be experiencing in their careers. So some of these things will be quite obvious, but I think it's worth reminding you. I mean, obviously, we all work many, many different ways than we might have done before COVID. And we've proven that remote and hybrid working can work, although depending on your own context, you may have different approaches. You may be in environments which have continued to work fully flexibly. You may be in hybrid, or you may be in environments where you've been asked to come back in on a more frequent basis as well. So interesting to think about how that helps or potentially hinders career progression. We know that AI is changing daily and having an impact, many of them being positive in the workplace as well, but that is a lot of change that we're dealing with. There's more competition for roles, particularly now that people can work more flexibly. I'm sure you remember the rather sensationalist headlines around Great Resignation in 2021 as a result of the pandemic, people really reassessing what they wanted in their careers and leaving organizations. And then the following year, the quiet quitting, which was more a reflection of people perhaps disengaging, not leaving, but disengaging in their work. So some interesting, as I say, rather sensationalist, but maybe interesting to think around some of those trends and what was happening. Perhaps more emphasis on temporary roles in some sectors, virtual recruitment practices now more commonplace for people. And what I see in career planning is that has become increasingly challenging for both the organizations we work with and the individuals, because so much is changing in real time. As soon as you've tried to map out career pathways, for example, they may have changed fundamentally. Big emphasis on, I think, the pressure placed on managers within organizations. That comes up a lot when we're working with managers around career conversations and increasing sort of pressures and responsibilities. So something very mindful of in terms of the career landscape and how managers support. And I think fundamentally we could say there has been a huge sort of seismic shift in the last few years in how people engage with work emotionally, socially, and physically. So some would say a shift in power balance as well towards the employee. So if we think about some of the positive and negatives that has tended to be put forward, and some of this is based on our own experience of CCS, of working with individuals in their careers and organizations, as well as some of the research studies, which I've included links to at the end. But these last few years have had both positive and negative consequences, particularly on career. And whilst we can't generalize to everybody, there will always be individual differences. These are just some of the key things I wanted to pull out. So there are positives about remote and hybrid working. I certainly personally notice that. I have a young family, but there is literature and studies to suggest that has positively impacted and reduced levels of burnout for some, and made and equated greater productivity for others, not always. And we're going to talk a little bit about the links between burnout and imposter syndrome as well. Flexibility, seen as much more positive in many respects by both men and women. We're seeing patterns amongst those in early careers who perhaps have different expectations about how they work, and they value much more so perhaps than some other generations, a focus on both physical and mental health as well-being, and they're much more likely to engage with employers who are demonstrating sort of commitment, not just sort of good intentions to physical and mental health priorities. People reporting they can better integrate work and life, and 1 in 5, interesting stat, claiming flexibility has supported career development, but not always for everybody. On the less positive side, as I've alluded to, there is more competition, there's lack of predictability in roles and skills planning. For those in early careers, there are concerns about taking on debt following studies, and perhaps more an emphasis on seeking sectors that pay better. There was also a lot of limited work experience opportunity for people in early careers during COVID. So I think that's had on some knock-on consequences to the workplace. Seeing women, interestingly, although some research suggests that there's better gender representation at sort of C-suite levels in organizations, a kind of closer look suggests that that's amongst often the NED population rather than the employed population. So there was still a lot of research suggesting that women, as they are progressing to more senior levels in the organization, are stepping out. And there's a lot of sort of potential midlife factors that may be going on there, but it does have an impact in the workplace. I think it's going to be interesting to think about how imposter syndrome may be contributing to that. And something I put at this sort of gap between policy and lived experience, that's something that comes up a lot between sort of stated intention in the workplace and what is actually happening. McKinsey reported a lot of increase in these microaggressions at work since this move to virtual and hybrid working. So it's interesting how that has sort of gone up in the way that we work, and perhaps often innocuous comments, well-meaning comments, you look tired today, can be misinterpreted, and particularly noticeable for women and ethnic minorities as well. For example, women getting mistaken for somebody less senior in their career, and those sorts of things happening. So just some interesting things to throw into the mix here before we move on. Oh, that's the next slide. I just wanted to highlight a few barriers that tend to come up in my experience when people are thinking about career development. And there's often this sort of interplay between some structural level organizational barriers and perhaps some self-imposed barriers. And we're going to sort of consider from both lenses today, but you can see there some of the organizational barriers that may come up. It'd be interesting for you to reflect on what you see in your own environments. But sometimes people find the lack of these things challenging, or at least their perception of a lack of these things. Flexibility, role models. Are there enough learning resources available? Can they visibly see enough career pathways or ways forward? The gender pay gap, and we know that imposter syndrome is one of the 3 contributing factors to the gender pay gap. Career break penalties, where people have stepped out for a period of time, and what that means when they come back in. And resource and skills in terms of managers having career conversations with organizations. These can all come up as barriers. I've mentioned social and cultural barriers there at a slightly wider level, but self-imposed barriers, which often come up for both men and women. We'll look at some of the data in a minute, but things like confidence and imposter syndrome. And I'm going to touch a bit more on both of those because I think there is a difference between the two. But I just wanted to set a little bit of context to the career landscape for men and women before diving in to looking at some of the research around imposter syndrome. So I think we're going to do a poll in just a moment, but imposter syndrome, I just wanted to share a couple of definitions. There's some fantastic research that has been done by Claire Josa, who actually it was a really longitudinal study. It was 20-year study and really looked at several thousand respondents in terms of a survey, so quantitative-based survey, but then had some very in-depth qualitative interviews with a quarter of those that were followed up over a number of years. I think that's what makes this research really interesting. And Claire, you can see Claire's definition there about the secret fear of being found out as not good enough, despite often plenty of evidence to the contrary. And what is interesting, I think, about imposter syndrome in this research is that Claire's research really suggests that it very much affects women and men equally. So you can see the stats there. And years ago, the first study, 1978, I think that was Clance and Immis who first looked at that, only looked at it in women. So I think more recent research sort of dispels that. KPMG have looked at women executives there, and statistics quite high, 75%, saying that they feel they don't deserve to be in those positions or roles. And I think what's really interesting about imposter syndrome is that it does serve us well. So some research has measured it as a spectrum rather than a yes or no. So you can see there, Helena Gonzalez Gomez of Neoma Business School did a very interesting survey. That's in the links as well. But the approach was very much to ask people to rate it in terms of different times and stages in their career. So you can see the stats there. So the idea that it's not a yes or no, but it's thinking about the contextual factors. So I think that's an interesting way of considering that we might all suffer from it to varying degrees, but it may be dialed up in different scenarios. And we're going to look a little bit later, but it can be useful at certain times. But if unchecked or it gets out of control, that is where it's problematic. So Richard, I think we've got a poll now. I'd just love to get a sense of what you notice in the workplace in terms of how imposter syndrome tends to manifest. So we've got 5 options there to just kick off our discussions. What do you notice perhaps? Might be in terms of yourself or potentially colleagues' behaviours that you tend to notice. Just give people a chance to vote there on what you notice tending to be the most perhaps observable aspect. Thank you. I can see the numbers just totting up there. Is that everybody, I think? Not quite.
Excuse me.
Going up. 90% voted. People still voting there. And then Richard, when that's complete, maybe you'll just share so everybody else can see what's coming up, and I can comment on that as you're doing that. So coming up at the highest at the moment, interestingly, we've got not applying for development roles. So 34% of you suggesting that people are not putting themselves forward for development because of imposter syndrome, working long or excessive hours. That's also coming through. Actually, it's changed in real time now, and the not being able to say no is coming through at 34% as well. Interesting, micromanagement and perfectionism much lower. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Richard, for running that. It's quite interesting, isn't it, when we think about how this might be manifesting in the workplace. And some things are perhaps more observable than others. But I remember years ago being absolutely perplexed by the behaviours of some colleagues who were seemingly very capable, high achieving, but yet at certain points would struggle to deliver on time, for example, or it would disappear on sick leave after key projects or initiatives, or perhaps some deadlines weren't being met at all. Certainly noticed sort of micro behaviours that often came up in colleagues, so people not, for example, speaking up in meetings. That's one that I often notice as well. So people really not speaking up, perhaps not taking credit for their own successes or their own roles in things, maybe not putting themselves forward, as you've said, for roles or promotions or asking for pay rises. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at some of this research. So Claire Joseph's research describes the 4 sort of categories, the 4 Ps in terms of how this might manifest. So 4 Ps: perfectionism, people-pleasing, paralysis, and procrastination. So I quite like the 4 Ps. And so I think it's useful to consider sometimes some of the knock-on effects of imposter syndrome in the workplace. So perfectionism may have a knock-on effect in teams where people are not delegating, for example. This often can happen when people are newly promoted as well. So people's reluctance to delegate, or really not seeing things as just good enough can be quite difficult. Procrastination, really interesting one. So sometimes, we get sort of stuck in that cycle that things have to be just perfect or just right as well. We can't move forward, and we get stuck in that sort of cycle of procrastination. And these are all linked, by the way. So paralysis, we often then end up in that sort of freezing mode. And this might be where people disappear or deadlines get missed as well. And people pleasing, interestingly, sometimes that can be seen as a good thing, particularly if colleagues are seen to be going sort of above and beyond what is expected of them. But of course, that can tip over and that can cause them issues with things like work-life balance, potentially burnout because their resources get more and more depleted as well. Interestingly, it's particularly prevalent for entrepreneurs as well. So sometimes, some other things I've mentioned there, workaholism, indecisiveness, risk aversion, micromanagement behaviors often come out as well. And there may be some underlying issues that are going on for people here linked to fears of failure, limiting beliefs. We often say beliefs that people hold about what certain roles should look like or what they should be. And these are identity issues. So in order to be X, I need to be this way. So often that's a big problem for people suffering from imposter syndrome, which is different to general confidence. And I think that is one of the key myths with imposter syndrome, because people who are usually very, very confident in many situations can also suffer from imposter syndrome. So again, I think that's one of the other myths. It doesn't mean people don't lack confidence. I think what we're talking about here are identity level issues in terms of how people see themselves and view themselves in their careers. So just picking up on a couple of these things, it can have knock-on effects in the workplace in terms of the links between individual performance and productivity, mental health, and the wider organizational success. So when these things trip over into teams. Interestingly, the research has said imposter syndrome, one of the things it really stifles is sort of creativity and people being able to think more innovatively about solutions and problems. So that's both in terms of workload, but also career planning and career decision making. So if imposter syndrome is being dialed up, people are finding it very, very difficult to think creatively about what they want in their career, to tap into visioning and to think about their decisions. So they often sort of retreat, if you like, into their comfort zone. So often convincing themselves it's easier to put my head down, to be good enough at my job and to stay within my comfort zone. So, that really can impact on whether people put themselves forward for development opportunities or promotion, as you've said. What is interesting about the research is that although men and women both claim to suffer from imposter syndrome, the research suggests that when men are promoted and sort of see themselves moving more into senior roles, we talk about vertical career progression, imposter syndrome tends to be reported as decreasing, but actually when women get promoted, imposter syndrome tends to increase and go up. So it's based on individual self-reports. And I've talked a little bit there about those suffering from it. This is really linked to people pleasing, but may go into sort of overdrive into terms of the organizational sort of citizenship behaviors, wanting to do more, to please more. And that's where we get into sort of depleting resources. And the research also looks interestingly at sometimes what may be going on in toxic workplace cultures. So, where you've tried to fix it, you've done a lot of team interventions, initiatives, but it may be that there's an issue with somebody who has been promoted into a leadership role and imposter syndrome, and in the knock-on effect where you get teams concerned about upsetting the boss, really. So the sort of the consequences are being magnified. So as I say, I put some links to research at the end, but want to get into thinking about, okay, how can we think about this in more practical, useful terms? So you might have heard the fake it until you make it old Old adage, you heard that one. It's not one of my favorite ones. A slightly better one, I think, is, make believe it until you believe it. However, I think it's too glib and it glosses over what we're talking about here. So we're talking about identity level issues with imposter syndrome. So it's not associating yourself with your perceived success. So it's a gap essentially between how you see yourself and what you perceive success to look like in that role in your career. So as I say, it doesn't mean that you lack confidence if you're suffering from imposter syndrome or that it's been dialed up at a certain point in your career. You can still feel confident in many situations and still have imposter syndrome and vice versa. We often develop a lot of coping strategies, but they're not always helpful. A lot of people say, well, I just need to push through it, particularly women. I need to push through this. But that's when we can find ourselves in a kind of constant state of hypervigilance on that sort of anxiety, high alert. And that's where the research suggests there are links to burnout. We get sort of trapped in a cycle of doing more and more to compensate. So these are just some things to be aware of. But I think this idea that imposter syndrome is a spectrum, and there are some ways that we can begin to manage this is useful. So I want to give you a few minutes reflection just for yourself before we get into breakout rooms and have some discussions to bring this to life. But just in terms of yourself, and I'm not going to ask you to share about yourself in a breakout room, but more to talk more generally around the topic. But just before you go in, give you sort of 2 to 3 minutes for yourself. And I want you to bear in mind that our imposter can be useful for us if it's managed well. So it can serve us. But I want you to think about what that little voice in your head, your imposter, might tell you and what you like about your imposter syndrome. How does it serve you? And mine keeps me on my toes. It keeps me just sort of prepared enough that I'm able to prepare well in terms of my planning. So it's useful to a point. It's useful in thinking about, okay, what do I need to do in order for this to be successful? But there may be times, and I'll share briefly with you, when I'm in a room full of academics, my imposter kicks in because I see myself very much as someone who's very practical. I like linking theories, concepts to practice, but I'm not an academic, and there are some times where that really dials up my imposter. So what does success look like for you? What one belief might you be holding about success and failure that might not be true? It might be a belief you hold and a blueprint from your own life experience. Maybe it's not true. Just take some notes for yourself. And maybe just one thought, one action you might be willing to take to just challenge some of that thinking and challenge your imposter. We just have 2 quiet minutes, and those watching back on video, encourage you to do this for yourself. Welcome 2 minutes for yourself. And then we'll go into the rooms, if that's okay, Richard, for some discussion. Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll pop you into rooms to give you a chance to reflect on the input so far and maybe some of your own reflections there. So you don't have to share from your own perspective, but just the question really is, how have you noticed imposter syndrome impacting in the workplace? So to share, excuse me, some thoughts and ideas in small groups just to stimulate some further thinking and learning. So we'll just have 10 minutes in the rooms, and then we'll come back and perhaps share a little bit before we think about what we can practically do to help with some of this.
There we go. Right, I think
Thank
we've
you.
got about 50 minutes or so. Questions or thoughts? Kate, I interrupted you, sorry.
Oh, thank you, everybody. And I got to go into a breakout room, so fascinating to be in the room. I hope you all had some good discussions. Please feel free, to pop in any thoughts, observations, comments, or questions into the chat as well. And we will have some time in just a moment to look at those. I just wanted to share a couple of other ideas and thoughts before we just open it up a bit further, if that's okay. So, we were chatting in our room about how this impacts, particularly in terms of career development, people holding themselves back. One of your colleagues in the room was describing somebody, who said, I just didn't think to go for that role. So I think that happens a lot in organizations. So a couple of practical things that we can think about maybe in terms of organization responses. I think how we equip our managers to recognize and look out for imposter syndrome and to be aware of it in the kind of conversations they're having is quite important. I know it's not always easy, but I think encouraging feedback to focus on positives and anything that is developmental to avoid sort of being very personalized. Anything more neutral is likely to reduce the sort of impact on creativity in particular and people's motivation and them wanting to try. Support structures. I think one of the things we were talking about in the rooms I was in is really about trying to normalize this conversation. We're now talking about so many more subjects in the workplace, including things like menopause, and this idea of bringing our whole selves to work. We call it sort of the holistic approach, and hopefully that can create a better platform to talk about things like imposter syndrome. And we were talking about the importance of people in leadership roles really sort of modeling that, sharing their stories, and modeling vulnerability as well. We had a great comment in the room that actually, if none of us ever move forward, because until we thought we'd sort of nailed it or made it, no development would happen. So I think the more and more people who can share those stories in organizations, the more it helps to normalize that we suffer from this. Thank you. I know there's some comments coming through in the chat. Just a couple of things I wanted to share, and then we'll open it up. So how can we address it, and can we resolve it? And I'm not sure we need to resolve it. I think there's an important point to consider that actually it's useful in certain circumstances, but it's reducing the negative impact we want to get to. So in terms of career conversations and career development, I think some of these areas are useful so that in our career conversations, when we're supporting people, whether we're designing frameworks for managers to have career conversations, helping individuals to raise awareness of what may be holding them back, some of their limiting beliefs. The person who said, I didn't think to go for that role in one of the teams, what was that belief? What was holding them back? There may be something around, someone like me can't do this because of X. So, having these conversations is important. Getting people to own and internalize success and recognize their strengths. How often have you heard someone say, I've just been really lucky in my career? I encourage you to watch out for that word. That's something I hear a lot in career coaching. And is that person really recognizing what they've done, how they've achieved it, and their role, their kind of agency in that? And then helping them to think, as I've done with you, using that structure, how does your imposter serve you? How is it useful? But when is it a problem? When is it holding you back? How might that be manifesting? And then thinking about any actions to close that gap between what they define as successful and how they're seeing themselves. So that's the identity gap. And in terms of getting to the practical tool that I wanted to share that you can take away and use with colleagues, maybe reflecting for yourself as well. But there is research to support that the more we can build our career management skills and career adaptability, the more we can kind of we can reduce feelings of imposter syndrome. So there's something about having less fixed ideas on what career success is and looks like, and helping individuals to construct how they see career on their own terms, according to their own life stories, their own skills, their own strengths, their own goals. So Savvikis came up with career construction theory, and some of the skills he was describing people really needing to develop in the workplace were around balancing sort of concerns with what they could control and being curious, which in turn impacts positively on confidence. So one tool I want to share with you, and then have a little more of a chat as well, is one of our own tools at CCS, planned happenstance. You may have come across this concept, the idea that careers are not fixed. There's not a fixed destination or pathway to which we're necessarily heading towards. Careers are significantly affected by chance and opportunity. So there's something here about the importance of embracing sometimes the unplanned, the unexpected. And what's important is to encourage career behaviors and skills that help us to better cope with the changing world of careers. And the skills here are linked to the ones I've just mentioned, but particularly around curiosity, again, persistence, flexibility, being optimistic, and taking risks. So it's an approach that can be useful to individuals to help them focus less on a fixed destination or outcome. I must be an HR director in organization by X. I'm more thinking about the skills, the experience, and the journey that they want to go on to be part of that. So may well still want to be an HR director within that, but it's more about the work and the nature of the skill sets that they're building. So this is something you could try with your colleagues. We're not going to have time to go off and discuss this one in breakout rooms, but I just want to leave you with the template, and Richard's going to kindly share this with you and circulate it afterwards. But encouraging individuals to think about when they've used these skills, rated on a 1 to 10 scale. Do they use these skills in this work? And how could they bring more of that into the workplace? How could they develop these skills so that they are constructing careers more on their own terms, and it gives them more of a sense of control about their career development and their career experience. So I know we haven't got too long, so I do want to make sure we've opened it up to a few comments, questions, ideas. I've got some resources that Richard will circulate with you after today. But yeah, anybody like to, we've got some time, we've got about 6 minutes left. There's a virtual hand, we could just raise a real hand, it doesn't, or in the chat, but anybody at all like to comment or share anything? I know we've mentioned a couple of podcasts in the rooms as well that we might share, that a couple of people recommended. Anyone like?
Hi,
Yeah.
just
Hi, Rachel.
I like your slide with the purple circles on, that it's quite practical. I'm thinking about those conversations that you have with managers who are supporting team members that are really in the thick of that imposter syndrome, and sometimes you end up having good conversations around it, but when it comes down to what are the practical building blocks that might help them, that slide is really useful. And I think the strength spotting really jumped out at me, because I think we're all much better at zooming in on the things that we don't think we're good at. And sometimes it's really powerful to have someone say, have you noticed you've got a massive strength in this? And like, what do you think about that? What might you want to do with that? Can be a really powerful thing to do as well. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. That's such a helpful point. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in the Claire Yosa research, the role of managers was shown as absolutely critical, as it so often is in so many topics. You know, if you've got a supportive and understanding manager that you can have a conversation with this about, who you can have a conversation with imposter syndrome about, you're more likely to be able to better manage this. So anything that we can share with managers who are, let's face it, often quite overwhelmed. They've got 1,000,001 things to do. Now they're supposed to deal with career conversations and imposter syndrome. Any practical things that you can share with them, you know, maybe scripting out in the way I did a few key questions, and getting them to model their own stories. I think career stories where people are showing how they have overcome it or how they've moved forward even with imposter syndrome. I think that's so critical. You know, I think using the language sort of overcome it is probably not too helpful. I quite like the sort of moving with it and embracing it, and just managing it more positively.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you said it is useful. Okay, that surprised me, and but then made sense when you said it. And then equally, as you were saying, in terms of practical results, if I can bring in Sue Swanborough's comment on chat too, actually, her reflection that it's more present in organisations than we may have previously thought, and also, as you say, Sue, that apparently confident people may have their imposter syndrome moments as well, which is, I think, was a nice point.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant points, and I think that is so true. And there are some real myths, aren't there, that, about confidence and imposter syndrome. And there may be situations where you feel exceptionally confident, and situations which absolutely dial up the imposter syndrome, and you suddenly start feeling a lot less confident. And that could even happen on the same day, depending on the context and who you might be dealing with and presenting to. I can see some comments in the chat as well.
Oh wow, Matt, come on! That can we welcome, by the way, to I think it's your first session, so very nice to see you along. But so you joined a future leader call, and it was every single one.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I think we sort of work on the basis that it's probably not necessarily by exception, but that a lot of people don't. But I think of it particularly, it might be a generalization, but as you get more senior, so these were like I work in the civil service, so senior civil servants, and all 3 or 4 of them sort of alluded to how they'd encountered imposter syndrome at some point during their careers, more as they got to that more senior level, which was really interesting. And I think it goes back to, which was really useful to see from my perspective, going back to that sort of comment about the vulnerability and role modeling those aspects of it, and being able to see a way through if sort of individuals themselves feel like they're sort of encountering it, that it's not unusual and not unique.
Sorry, Kate.
Just going to say how absolutely brilliant and heartening that is, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. But to get that many people sharing that, making it normal, and I think in the same way, we're seeing more examples of leaders talking openly about all sorts of things, mental health issues, menopause. This all plays into these, we like to call the more holistic approaches to career conversations, recognizing that we're all people. We've all got issues. We're not machines that operate independently in careers outside of life. So that's really heartening. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know we're conscious of time, Richard, so I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Kate. And then Ali, thanks for sharing the Patrick Lencioni podcast. I'll put that on the email as well. That's good of you. Thank you very much. Excellent to see you all. Thank you ever so much for taking part. Kate, really interesting. Learned a lot in that now. I really appreciate the thought and care you put into it. Lovely to have you back again. Kate's book will be out soon. We'll send out the slides and the link to the YouTube members channel, of course, tomorrow latest. And we'll see you all again soon. Kate, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.